like you said, when I started writing, I had no idea what the hell I was doing. I was just writing anything that was interesting to me and putting it in one document. And I think that document itself probably started like somewhere around 2012. And then, things would become interesting to me. And so I would just put them in. And so there were themes, but I had no intention of what was going to happen. And it wasn't until, like somewhere around 2016, I think, when I was like, oh, I think I know what this is doing. And it was actually, I was invited to do a reading series where it was just one reader and the theme was about Seattle. And I was like, oh, well, this is my writing about Seattle. So I knew the part that I thought was the most polished and I just pulled it out. And that actually became the beginning of the book. That was when I realized, oh, I have a beginning of a book. And I also was like that quest where I first end up at this bar, this gay bar Pony that you mentioned, where I've avoided gay bars for so long because what the hell is there for me? I already know like, these like racist, misogynist, like femphobic spaces of like, internalized and externalized hatred. But I get there and I feel everything that I already know, like the shade, the shame, the sadness, but also there's a sweetness. And so I'm like, oh, that's what I'm looking for is that sweetness. And I need it in order to be alive. And for me, desire is desire to get fucked, but it's also desire just to exist in the world with other bodies, with other people, with the air, with, sitting on the bus and someone's leg touches your leg. Like that can be desire. Desire can be gardening. Desire can be, talking on the phone with someone and that sudden, rush of intimacy. And so for me, I guess in the book, I'm pushing against these boundaries, these borders that are, in my mind, completely artificial and antithetical to like my survival and, and I think everyone's survival, and so in writing about sex, I think I'm always writing about the landscape. I mean, of course, when I'm writing about sex in the park, but also I feel like that, I guess that's something that I don't know that I was as aware of. I mean, after like, I don't know, a few decades of having these experiences, I've become very aware of the space, and like the beauty of that, like getting fucked inside of a rhododendron bush. I mean, come on, and like it feels to me much more, I don't know. I feel like some people like look at these stories and they're like, they feel like, oh, wow, or like, oh, sensation, or, like sensational, like for me, I guess it's that difference between sensational and sensation, right? For me, this is just everyday experience, and I actually, but also the thing that I'm pushing against is the ways that in these spaces that don't have to, there are literally no boundaries in this park, like in the literal sense. There's no fence, there are no walls. It is technically closed, but there's nothing that closes. But people's interactions are gated still, and there's still this obsession with this kind of normative masculinity, or this obsession with not talking, or this obsession with not communicating at all, really, and like, and how that is always pushing against my autonomy or my bodily self. And I feel like in a way, the sensation of the bark of the tree is part of me like finding a space for myself anyway. Like, no one's giving me that, but I can find it, even it's just an intuitive thing, and I think actually you have this great part in your book where you talk about, there's a chapter about BDSM and how in these spaces that are mostly queers of color and all different kinds of bodies and all different kinds of desires, where you feel a kind of sense of safety, I think you use that word, that you have not felt in, normative or like so-called vanilla, sex that people think of as being like not dangerous, right? That's the safe kind of sex. And you're like, well, that's actually what threatened me. And this is where I'm finding a kind of liberation. And you have this question that I really like, or it's a couple of questions that circle around each other, and they're both literal and figurative, where you ask, what is the knife? Right? And the knife, of course, in a BDSM space is a literal thing, right? But also, and where is the knife? And so I wonder if you want to talk, because I love that the way you flip, I think you're flipping like our expectations, and you're also flipping literal and figurative. And I wondered if you want to talk about how those questions figure into your own search for self and embodiment and pleasure and autonomy.
That's so good. There's this moment, I think, that it doesn't just happen once, it happens often. I think if you're a person in the world, where you realize that even gay culture can, and you have this in your book actually, how it mimics straight masculinity. Like the worst aspects of straight masculinity can be mimicked in gay culture. So, in the scene in my book, it's, where this woman is, there's a scene where it's happening in two different places and times. One is a woman during a sex party, and she's with a cis man, and he's like basically offering her body to be fucked without her permission. And then the other one is, or without her consent, so not in a sexy way. And then the other is, a woman laying on her back and being fucked by a play knife, while like a butch daddy is like, in control of everything. And yeah, for me, like I've definitely noticed spaces where even if, like for example, the Lex in San Francisco, been groped at the Lex without my consent and all of that stuff. But like you kind of, at some point you kind of expect this from every time I leave my house, I'm like something dangerous might happen. Which I think both of our books are completely in agreement about, like that there is no safety really. It's a fantasy. And yeah, for me personally, I feel like a lot of, like the really good outdoor sex I've had that has been safe was usually in my yard or whatever yard of whatever house I was renting. And herein comes like this fantasy of real estate, which you also talk about, right? Like this fantasy of controlling your space or controlling how you're going to live. It's just not real. And I think definitely when I'm talking about the knife, I am talking about masculinity, or I'm talking about like penetrative masculinity in some ways, and the dangers that lie there. So there's a really awesome part of your book where you talk about masculinity, and it's the top of page 207. Sometimes I think the main tension among faggots is between those who see masculinity as a burden and those who see it as a pleasure, between those who see masculinity as a refuge and those who see it as refuse. Masculinity is an ideal, and the ideal of refusing masculinity. I love that. I love that so much.